The bullet grazed so close to her ear that Felicity Portman could feel the heat of it slicing through the evening air. And she knew with absolute certainty that her desperate gamble had finally run out of luck. She pressed herself flat against the rocky outcropping, her worn dress catching on the sharp edges of stone as her breath came in ragged gasps. The New Mexico sun was setting fast, painting the sky in brilliant shades of orange and red that would have been beautiful if she wasn't running for her life. Well, not exactly her life this time, but her freedom certainly hung in the balance. The cattle she'd attempted to cut from the edge of the herd were already thundering back toward their pasture, spooked by the warning shot, and Felicity cursed under her breath at her failed attempt. "Come out with your hands where I can see them," a deep voice called from somewhere beyond the rocks. "I've got you surrounded, and I'm not known for my patience with cattle thieves." Felicity's heart hammered against her ribs. She wasn't a thief, not really. Desperate, yes. Hungry, absolutely. But not a thief in the way this rancher clearly thought. She'd only wanted one cow, maybe two at most, something to trade for supplies in the next town over. Her father had been dead for 3 months now, buried in an unmarked grave outside of Fort Sumner after the fever took him, and she'd been scraping by ever since on nothing but determination and increasingly bad decisions. "I said come out," the voice repeated, closer now. "Don't make me come in there and drag you out." She had 2 choices: run and likely get shot, or surrender and face whatever justice a wealthy rancher decided to mete out to a trespasser. Neither option appealed to her, but at least one of them didn't end with a bullet in her back. Felicity took a deep breath, raised her trembling hands, and stepped out from behind the rocks. The man who stood 20 feet away was not what she expected. Most ranchers she'd encountered were either grizzled old men with tobacco-stained beards or soft-handed businessmen who hired others to do their dirty work. This man was neither. He couldn't have been more than 30, with dark hair that curled slightly at his collar and sharp green eyes that assessed her with an intensity that made her want to shrink back behind the rocks. He was tall, broad-shouldered, and held his rifle with the easy confidence of someone who knew how to use it. Dust covered his worn jeans and the dark shirt that stretched across his chest, and despite the situation, Felicity found herself noting that he was handsome in a rough, weathered sort of way. "A woman," he said, and something flickered across his face that might have been surprise. He lowered the rifle slightly but didn't put it away. "You're the one who's been cutting my fences and spooking my herd." "I never cut any fences," Felicity said, trying to keep her voice steady even as her whole body shook. "And I wasn't trying to spook anything. I just needed one cow." "Just one cow," he repeated, his tone dry. "Well, that makes it perfectly acceptable then. Help yourself to my livelihood because you only need one." Heat flooded her cheeks, a combination of shame and anger. "I wasn't stealing. I was going to leave payment." "Oh." He gestured around the empty landscape. "I don't see any payment here. Just a trespasser on my land trying to make off with my cattle." Felicity reached into her pocket slowly, conscious of the rifle still pointed vaguely in her direction, and pulled out a small leather pouch. She tossed it toward him, and it landed in the dirt at his feet with a soft clink. "That's everything I have. $42. It's not enough for a whole cow, I know, but it's something. It's honest." The rancher stared at the pouch for a long moment before crouching down to pick it up. He opened it, counted the money quickly, and then looked back at her with an expression she couldn't quite read. $42 is about a third of what a healthy cow is worth, and you were going to take 2. "I was only going to take what I could pay for eventually," she insisted, hating how her voice wavered. "I'd have sent the rest when I could. I'm not a thief." "Then what are you?" The question hung in the air between them, simple and yet impossibly complicated. What was she? An orphan, a failure, a woman alone in a territory that ate people like her alive. She'd been a daughter once when her father was alive. Before that, she'd been a student, learning to read and write in a small schoolhouse back in Missouri before everything went wrong. Before her mother died and her father dragged her west chasing dreams of gold that never materialized. "I'm someone trying to survive," she finally said, meeting his eyes with as much dignity as she could muster. "Same as everyone else out here." The rancher was quiet for a moment, studying her in a way that made her acutely aware of how she must look. Her dress was patched in multiple places, faded from brown to a strange grayish color by too many washings and too much sun. Her boots were held together more by hope than leather at this point, and her blonde hair, which she tried to pin up that morning, had mostly escaped its constraints and hung in tangled waves around her face. She was 22 years old and felt ancient. "What's your name?" he asked finally. "Felicity Portman." "Well, Miss Portman, I'm Caleb Quinn, and this is my ranch. About 15,000 acres of it, stretching from here to the mountains you can see in the distance." He gestured broadly, and Felicity felt her heart sink at the scale of the property she'd been foolish enough to trespass on. "I've worked this land for 8 years, built it up from nothing, and I don't take kindly to people helping themselves to what's mine." "I understand," she said quietly. "Are you going to turn me over to the sheriff?" Caleb Quinn looked at her for a long moment, and something shifted in his expression. "I should. That would be the sensible thing to do." He paused, weighing the rifle in his hands. "But I have a feeling the sheriff in Fort Sumner would just toss you in a cell for a few days, and then turn you loose with nowhere to go and nothing to your name." "That sound about right." Felicity nodded, not trusting herself to speak. He was exactly right, of course. She'd wind up right back where she started, only hungrier and more desperate. "I'll make you a deal," Caleb said slowly, as if the words were forming even as he spoke them. "You work off your debt. $42 won't buy you a cow, but it'll buy you some time. I need help around here. My last cook quit 3 weeks ago to get married, and I've been living on burnt beans and worse coffee ever since. You know how to cook?" "Yes," Felicity said quickly, hardly daring to believe what she was hearing. "I can cook. I can clean too and mend, and I'm good with chickens if you have any." "I've got chickens," he confirmed. "And about a dozen other things that need doing that I haven't had time for. You work here, earn your keep, and in a few months when you've worked off what you owe, we'll call it even. You'll get room and board, and I'll even throw in a small wage so you're not working for nothing. What do you say?" It was more than she dared hope for, so much more that she immediately became suspicious. "Why would you do that? You don't know me. I could be a terrible cook." "I could rob you blind the first chance I get." Caleb smiled then, a real smile that transformed his stern features into something almost boyish. "You could try, but I'm a light sleeper and a good shot. And as for why, well, I figure we're both in need of something. You need a way to survive, and I need someone who can make a pot of coffee that doesn't taste like saddle leather. Seems like a fair exchange to me." Felicity looked into his green eyes and saw what she thought might be honesty there, or at least a kind of practical compassion that was rare in her experience. She could say no, could take her $42 and walk away to try her luck elsewhere. But elsewhere had been getting harder and harder to find, and winter was coming in a few months. A roof over her head and regular meals sounded like paradise compared to the desperate uncertainty she'd been living with. "All right," she said, extending her hand. "You've got a deal, Mr. Quinn." His hand was calloused and warm when it closed around hers, his grip firm but not crushing. "Call me Caleb. If you're going to be working here, we might as well skip the formalities." He finally lowered the rifle completely, slinging it over his shoulder as he picked up her small pouch of money and held it out to her. "Here, keep this for now. You've earned it honestly and you might need it down the road." Felicity took the pouch back with shaking hands, hardly able to process this turn of events. An hour ago she'd been a failed cattle thief, and now she had a job and something resembling hope. "Thank you," she managed to say. "I promise I'll work hard. You won't regret this." "I hope not," Caleb said, but his tone was more amused than concerned. "Come on, the ranch house is about a mile from here. We'd better get moving before it's full dark. The coyotes get bold at night, and I'd rather not have to shoot any if I can avoid it." He turned and started walking, clearly expecting her to follow. Felicity hesitated for just a moment, looking back at the rocks where she'd been hiding and the vast expanse of prairie beyond. She was committing herself to this now, to working for a man she didn't know on a ranch in the middle of nowhere. It could be a terrible mistake. He could be lying about everything, could have plans for her that had nothing to do with cooking or cleaning. But something in his manner, in the straightforward way he dealt with her, made her think otherwise. And really, what choice did she have? She was out of options and nearly out of time. Felicity turned and followed Caleb Quinn into the gathering darkness, toward whatever future awaited her at his ranch. The ranch house appeared gradually out of the twilight, a solid structure of wood and stone that looked like it had been built to withstand anything the New Mexico territory could throw at it. It was larger than Felicity had expected, 2 stories with a wide porch that wrapped around the front and side. Warm light glowed in several windows, and she could see the dark shapes of outbuildings scattered nearby, barns and storage sheds and what might have been a bunkhouse. "Most of my ranch hands live in town and ride out during the day," Caleb explained as they approached. "I've got 2 who stay on the property, Miguel and his son Rafael. They've got a cabin on the north side of the ranch. Good men, been with me for 6 years now." He led her up the porch steps and through the front door into a spacious main room that served as both living area and dining space. The furniture was simple but well made, and everything was covered in a thin layer of dust that spoke to weeks of bachelor living. Dirty dishes were piled in a basin near what she assumed was the kitchen, and the whole place had the slightly stale smell of a house that needed a woman's touch. "It's not much," Caleb said, and he actually sounded a bit embarrassed. "I know it's a mess. Like I said, my cook quit, and I've been focused more on the ranch than on keeping house." "It's fine," Felicity assured him, and she meant it. Compared to some of the places she'd stayed in the past few months, this was practically a palace. "I've seen worse. I've lived in worse." He showed her to a small room off the kitchen that had clearly been meant for hired help. It contained a narrow bed with a corn husk mattress, a simple dresser, a washstand with a basin and pitcher, and a small window that looked out toward the eastern hills. The room was clean despite the dust elsewhere, and the bed had fresh linens folded on top of it. "You can get settled in here," Caleb said from the doorway. "I'll give you tonight to rest up, and we can start fresh in the morning. Breakfast is usually around dawn, and I'll go over your duties then." "All right," Felicity said, setting her small bundle of possessions down on the bed. Everything she owned in the world fit into one cloth sack, a depressing reality she tried not to think about too often. "And thank you again for giving me a chance." Caleb nodded, his expression softening slightly. "Everyone deserves a chance, Miss Portman. Sometimes we just need someone willing to give it to us." He paused in the doorway, then added, "There's bread and cheese in the kitchen if you're hungry. Help yourself. And the well is just outside the back door if you need water." Then he was gone, his footsteps heavy on the wooden floors as he made his way to what she assumed was his own room upstairs. Felicity stood in the small room that was now hers, at least temporarily, and felt the overwhelming urge to cry. She'd been holding herself together through sheer force of will for so long, refusing to break down because breaking down meant admitting defeat. But now, in this quiet moment of unexpected kindness, the tears came hot and fast. She cried for her father, dead and buried far from the home he'd left behind. She cried for her mother, gone even longer, taken by cholera when Felicity was just 16. She cried for herself, for the girl she'd been who had dreams of becoming a teacher, of having a little house and a family and a life that made sense. That girl felt like a stranger now, someone from a different lifetime. But she also cried with relief, because for the first time in months, she wasn't facing tomorrow with nothing but fear and uncertainty. She had a place to sleep, food to eat, and work to do. It was more than she'd had this morning, and that was something. When the tears finally stopped, Felicity washed her face in the basin, changed into the only other dress she owned, which was marginally less worn than the one she'd been wearing, and ventured out into the kitchen. She found the bread and cheese Caleb had mentioned, along with some apples that were slightly withered but still edible, and a jug of cool milk that must have come from a cow that very morning. She made herself a simple meal and ate it slowly, savoring every bite. Tomorrow she would start earning her keep, would prove to Caleb Quinn that his faith in her wasn't misplaced. But tonight, she was just going to be grateful for a full stomach and a safe place to rest. The first rays of dawn were just beginning to paint the sky pink when Felicity woke to the sound of someone moving around in the kitchen. She dressed quickly in the same dress from the night before, since her only other one wasn't really suitable for work, and splashed water on her face before venturing out. Caleb was at the stove, attempting to make coffee and failing spectacularly based on the acrid smell filling the room. He looked up when she entered, and she could see the relief in his eyes. "Please tell me you can do better than this," he said, gesturing at the pot of what could generously be called coffee. "I can definitely do better than that," Felicity assured him, moving to take over. "When was the last time you cleaned this pot?" "Cleaned it?" Caleb looked genuinely confused, and Felicity had to suppress a smile. "Never mind. I'll take care of it. Why don't you go do whatever it is you normally do in the morning, and I'll have breakfast ready in half an hour." He looked like he wanted to argue, probably not used to being ordered around in his own house, but then he just nodded and headed for the door. "I'll be in the barn checking on one of the horses. She's about to foal, and I want to make sure everything's progressing normally." After he left, Felicity set to work. First, she properly cleaned the coffee pot, scrubbing away months of built-up residue. Then she measured out fresh grounds and water in the correct proportions and set it to boil. While the coffee brewed, she investigated the pantry and found eggs, bacon, flour, and all the makings of a proper breakfast. By the time Caleb returned, she had coffee, eggs, bacon, and fresh biscuits laid out on the table. The look on his face when he saw it all was almost comical. "Is that real coffee I smell?" he asked, approaching the table like a man in a dream. "It is," she confirmed, pouring him a cup, "and everything else is hot and ready." He sat down and took a sip of the coffee, closing his eyes with an expression of pure bliss. "I take back anything bad I might have thought about you last night. You're a miracle worker." Felicity felt heat creep into her cheeks at the compliment, unused to praise after so many months of barely surviving. "It's just breakfast." "It's the best breakfast I've had in months," he countered, digging into the eggs. "These biscuits, did you make these this morning? It doesn't take long if you know what you're doing." They ate in companionable silence for a few minutes before Caleb pushed back his plate and pulled out a piece of paper and a pencil. "All right, let's go over what needs doing around here. Obviously, cooking is the main thing, 3 meals a day." breakfast around dawn, lunch at noon, and dinner in the evening. I'm not picky about what you make as long as it's edible and there's plenty of it." Felicity nodded, mentally cataloging what she'd seen in the pantry and what she might need to request. "Then there's the general housekeeping," he continued. "Sweeping, dusting, that sort of thing. I don't need it to be fancy, just clean enough that I'm not embarrassed if someone drops by. The laundry usually gets done on Mondays, and there's a good setup for it out back." "What about the chickens you mentioned?" Felicity asked. "Right, the chickens. There's about 20 of them in the coop behind the house. They need to be fed and watered daily and the eggs collected. Usually get about a dozen eggs a day if the hens are happy." "I can handle that." Caleb studied her for a moment, and she had the uncomfortable feeling that he was seeing more than she wanted him to. "You've done this kind of work before." It wasn't a question, but she answered anyway. "My mother ran a boarding house back in Missouri before she died. I helped her with all of it from the time I was old enough to reach the stove. Cooking, cleaning, laundry, mending, I know how to do it all." "What brought you out here then?" he asked gently. "Missouri to New Mexico is a long journey, especially for a woman alone." Felicity hesitated, unsure how much to share, but something about Caleb's open expression made her want to be honest. "My father. After my mother died, he got it in his head that we needed a fresh start. He'd heard stories about silver strikes in New Mexico, thought he could make our fortune. So we packed up everything and came west. I take it the fortune didn't pan out, not even close. He worked himself to exhaustion in the mines around Fort Sumner for 2 years and had nothing to show for it but debt and broken dreams. When the fever came through last spring, he was too weak to fight it off." She stared down at her hands, noting the calluses and scars that mapped out her recent history. "He died owing more than he'd ever earned, and I had to work just to pay for his burial. After that, I've been doing whatever I could to get by." "I'm sorry," Caleb said, and he sounded like he meant it. "That's a hard road for anyone, much less a woman on her own." "I'm managing," Felicity said, lifting her chin. "I've made it this far." "You have," he agreed. "And that says something about your character. Not many people would have kept going." The compliment warmed something inside her that had been cold for a long time. "Well, giving up seemed worse than going on, so here I am." Caleb smiled at that, a genuine smile that crinkled the corners of his eyes. "Here you are, and I'm glad for it, since it means I finally get to drink decent coffee again." They spent the next hour going over the details of the ranch and what her daily routine would look like. Caleb was surprisingly easy to talk to, with none of the condescension or inappropriate behavior she'd feared might come from working for a single man. He was straightforward and practical, treating her like a valued employee rather than a desperate woman he was taking advantage of. As the sun climbed higher in the sky, Caleb stood and grabbed his hat from the peg by the door. "I need to ride out and check on the herd in the north pasture. Miguel and Raphael will be by around noon for lunch, so plan on 3 for the midday meal. They're good men, but they eat like they haven't seen food in a week, so make plenty." "I will," Felicity promised. "Anything they don't like or can't eat. Raphael's got a sweet tooth, and Miguel will eat anything you put in front of him. They're not complicated." He paused at the door, looking back at her. "You going to be all right here on your own?" "I'll be fine," she assured him. "I've got plenty to keep me busy." After he left, Felicity stood in the kitchen of the ranch house and allowed herself a moment to simply breathe. She'd done it. She'd found a way forward, at least for now. It wasn't the life she'd imagined for herself, but it was honest work with fair pay, and that was more than she'd had yesterday. She rolled up her sleeves and got to work, starting with the mountain of dishes that had accumulated. As she worked, she found herself thinking about Caleb Quinn. He wasn't what she'd expected when she'd stepped out from behind those rocks with her hands up. She'd expected anger, maybe even violence. Instead, she'd found understanding and an unexpected kindness that had probably saved her life, or at least her future. He was handsome too, she admitted to herself as she scrubbed a particularly stubborn pot. Not in a polished, citified way, but in the rough, capable manner of a man who worked with his hands and knew the value of hard effort. She'd noticed the strength in his arms when he'd lifted the coffee pot that morning, the way his shirt stretched across his shoulders. She'd noticed the green of his eyes, bright against his tanned skin, and the way his dark hair curled slightly when it needed cutting. Felicity shook her head, forcing those thoughts away. The last thing she needed was to develop feelings for her employer. This was a business arrangement, nothing more. She would work off her debt, save up some money, and then figure out what came next. Romance, if it ever came at all, would have to wait until she was on steadier ground. But as she worked through the morning, preparing lunch for 3 hungry men and tidying up the main room, she couldn't quite stop herself from wondering what it might be like to have someone like Caleb Quinn look at her as more than just his hired help. She imagined those green eyes softening with affection, imagined what it might feel like to have those strong hands touch her with tenderness instead of just practicality. "Stop it," she told herself firmly. "You're being ridiculous. Focus on the work." She focused on the work. Lunch was a success, or at least that's what she gathered from the way Miguel and Rafael cleaned their plates and asked for seconds. Miguel was a man in his 50s with silver threading through his dark hair and a ready smile that reminded her of her father. Rafael was younger, probably close to Felicity's own age, with the same warm eyes as his father and a shy demeanor that made him duck his head whenever she spoke directly to him. "Miss Portman is a fine cook," Miguel said to Caleb in thickly accented English as they finished their meal. "You were smart to hire her. Maybe now you won't be so grumpy all the time." "Yes," Caleb rolled his eyes good-naturedly. "I'm not grumpy." "You are very grumpy," Raphael added, speaking up for the first time, "like a bear with a thorn in his paw." Felicity bit back a smile as she cleared the table, enjoying the easy banter between the 3 men. It spoke to a relationship built on years of mutual respect and friendship, and she found herself hoping that she might eventually be included in that circle. The days fell into a rhythm after that. Felicity would wake before dawn, start the coffee, and prepare breakfast. Caleb would eat quickly and head out to work on the ranch, often not returning until lunch or sometimes even dinner. She would spend her days cooking, cleaning, tending the chickens, and slowly bringing order to the ranch house that had clearly been neglected for too long. She learned the quirks of the old stove, figured out which floorboards creaked and which windows stuck, and discovered that the house had good bones beneath the layer of dust and bachelor neglect. She hung curtains that she found packed away in a trunk upstairs, curtains that had clearly been made by a woman's hands and made her wonder about Caleb's history. Was he a widower? Had he been engaged once? He never mentioned a woman, and she didn't feel comfortable asking. In the evenings, after dinner was done and the dishes were washed, Caleb would sometimes sit on the porch and Felicity would join him. They didn't always talk, but there was a comfortable quality to the silence between them. Sometimes he would tell her about the ranch, about his plans for expanding the herd or improving the grazing land. Sometimes she would share memories of her childhood in Missouri, back when life was simpler and her parents were both alive. Why ranching? She asked him one evening as they watched the sun set over the distant mountains. "You don't strike me as someone who grew up doing this." Caleb was quiet for a moment, his long legs stretched out in front of him as he leaned back in his chair. "You're right, I didn't. I grew up in Philadelphia, actually. My father was a banker. Felicity couldn't hide her surprise. Philadelphia. That's about as far from New Mexico as you can get. In more ways than just distance, he agreed. My father had very specific plans for my life. I was supposed to go to university, study business, and eventually take over his bank. Nice, respectable, boring. What happened? I turned 21 and realized that if I followed his plan, I'd spend the rest of my life behind a desk, slowly dying of boredom. So I took my inheritance from my mother, who'd passed when I was young, said goodbye to my father, who didn't speak to me for 2 years after, and headed west. Did you know anything about ranching? Not a single thing, Caleb admitted with a self-deprecating smile. I was probably the most ignorant tenderfoot who ever set foot in New Mexico territory. I made every mistake you can imagine and a few that were entirely original. Miguel says he's still amazed I didn't get myself killed in the first year. But you learned, Felicity said. I learned. I worked for other ranchers, asked 1,000 questions, read every book I could find, and slowly figured it out. It took 8 years to build this place up to what it is now, and I'm proud of every acre of it. It's mine in a way nothing in Philadelphia ever was. Felicity understood that feeling, that need to build something of your own even if it meant starting from nothing. Do you ever regret it? Leaving your old life behind? Not for a second, Caleb said firmly. My father and I eventually made peace before he died 3 years ago. He never really understood why I chose this life, but he respected that I'd made something of myself. That was enough. They sat in silence for a while, watching the stars emerge one by one in the darkening sky. Felicity was acutely aware of Caleb's presence beside her, of the solid strength he represented. She'd been alone for so long, carrying all her burdens by herself, that it was strange and wonderful to simply sit with someone who seemed to understand what it meant to choose a hard path because it was your own. What about you? Caleb asked eventually. If you could do anything, have any life you wanted, what would it be? Felicity thought about that, really thought about it. A few months ago, she would have said she just wanted to survive, to make it through one more day. But sitting here on this porch, with a full stomach and a safe place to sleep, she let herself want more. I used to want to be a teacher, she said slowly. Back in Missouri, I loved school. I loved learning and reading and the way knowledge could open up the world. I thought maybe I could give that to other children, help them see possibilities beyond their small towns. That's a good dream, Caleb said. What stopped you? Life, I suppose. My mother got sick, and I had to leave school to help run the boarding house. Then she died, and my father decided to drag me west, and teaching started to seem like something from a different lifetime. She paused, then added quietly, I still love to read, though, when I can find books. There's a whole shelf of them upstairs, Caleb said. In the room at the end of the hall. My mother was a great reader and I inherited her collection. You're welcome to borrow anything you like. Felicity turned to look at him in the darkness, trying to make out his expression. Really? You wouldn't mind? Why would I mind? They're just sitting there gathering dust. Better that someone enjoys them. He stood and stretched, his joints popping slightly. I should turn in, early morning tomorrow, but help yourself to the books anytime. After he went inside, Felicity sat on the porch a while longer, turning over their conversation in her mind. Every time she thought she had Caleb Quinn figured out, he surprised her with some new facet of his character. A banker's son from Philadelphia who became a rancher. A man who could be hard as nails when facing down a trespasser, but gentle enough to offer her his mother's books. She was developing feelings for him, she realized with a start. Real feelings that went beyond simple gratitude or appreciation for a handsome face. She enjoyed his company, looked forward to their evening conversations, found herself thinking about him during the day when he was out working the ranch. It was dangerous and foolish and completely inevitable. Felicity stood and went inside, checking the locks and banking the fire in the stove as she did every night. She knew she should guard her heart, should remember that this was temporary, and that Caleb had never given her any indication he saw her as more than his employee. But knowing what she should do and actually doing it were two very different things. That night, she lay in her small bed and admitted to herself what she'd been trying to deny for weeks. She was falling in love with Caleb Quinn, and she had no idea what to do about it. The seasons shifted as autumn settled over New Mexico, bringing cooler temperatures and the endless work of preparing for winter. Felicity had been at the ranch for nearly 3 months now, and the debt she'd incurred from her attempted cattle theft had long since been worked off. Caleb had told her as much 2 weeks ago, presenting her with a small ledger that showed her hours worked and wages earned. "You're paid up," he'd said, sliding the ledger across the kitchen table. "With interest, actually. You've worked harder than I had any right to expect, and you've earned every penny. If you want to move on, I'd understand, but I hope you'll stay. I can pay you proper wages now, $2 a week plus room and board. It's not a fortune, but it's fair." Felicity had looked at the ledger, at the neat columns of numbers that represented her freedom, and felt a complicated tangle of emotions. She could leave now. Could take the money she'd saved, catch a stage to Santa Fe or Albuquerque, and start fresh somewhere new. But the thought of leaving the ranch, leaving Caleb, made her chest ache in a way that had nothing to do with practical considerations. "I'll stay," she'd said simply. "If you'll have me." The relief on Caleb's face had been unmistakable. "I'll have you, gladly." So she'd stayed, and life continued its comfortable rhythm. But something had shifted between them since that conversation. Caleb seemed to relax around her more, would sometimes touch her hand when she passed him his coffee in the morning, would linger over dinner instead of rushing back to work. She caught him watching her sometimes with an expression she couldn't quite decipher, something warm and complicated that made her pulse quicken. For her part, Felicity had stopped trying to pretend she didn't have feelings for him. She was in love with Caleb Quinn, completely and hopelessly, and while she didn't say it out loud, she thought he might be developing feelings for her too. The way he smiled when he came in and found her in the kitchen, the care he took to ask about her day, the books he would leave on the kitchen table for her with little notes about which parts he'd enjoyed, all of it pointed to a man who cared about more than just having a good cook. But neither of them had spoken about it, had acknowledged the thing growing between them, and Felicity was starting to wonder if they ever would. Maybe it was enough to simply exist in this space, caring for each other in unspoken ways, never risking the comfortable balance they'd achieved by trying for something more. Then everything changed on a cold October morning when Caleb came in from checking the north pasture with blood on his shirt and fury in his eyes. "Someone's been cutting the fences again," he said, his voice tight with controlled anger. "And this time they took 5 head of cattle. 5 of my best breeding cows." Felicity set down the bread dough she'd been kneading, her heart sinking. "Rustlers? Has to be. This is too organized to be random theft. They knew exactly which fence to cut and which cattle to take." He paced the kitchen like a caged animal, his hands clenched into fists. "I'm riding into Fort Sumner to report it to the sheriff. Miguel and Rafael are going to patrol the property, see if we can figure out where they took the cattle. Is it dangerous?" Felicity asked, unable to keep the worry from her voice. Caleb paused in his pacing, his expression softening slightly when he looked at her. "It could be. Rustlers don't usually stick around to chat, but if they're desperate enough, they might put up a fight. Don't worry, though. I've dealt with this kind of thing before. That didn't make her feel better at all. The thought of Caleb riding into danger, possibly getting hurt or worse, made her stomach clench with fear. "Just be careful, please." He crossed the kitchen to where she stood, his hands coming up to rest gently on her shoulders. It was the most deliberate touch he'd ever given her, and Felicity found she couldn't breathe. "I'll be careful," he promised, his green eyes searching hers. "I've got too much worth coming home to these days to take stupid risks." The implication in those words hung between them, heavy with possibility. Felicity wanted to ask what he meant, wanted to reach up and touch his face and tell him exactly how she felt. But before she could find the courage, he stepped back, the moment broken. "I should go," he said, grabbing his rifle from the rack by the door. "I'll be back before dark, hopefully with some news from the sheriff." After he left, Felicity tried to focus on her work, but her mind kept circling back to those words. Too much worth coming home to. Did he mean her? Or was she reading too much into a simple statement? She kneaded the bread dough with more force than necessary, taking out her frustration on the innocent flour and water. The day dragged on with agonizing slowness. She prepared lunch for Miguel and Raphael, who returned from their patrol with grim news. They'd found tracks leading east toward the Badlands, but the trail had gone cold after a few miles. Whoever had taken the cattle knew what they were doing and had covered their tracks well. "Caleb will find them," Miguel said confidently as he finished his meal. "He is like a dog with a bone when someone steals from him. He will not let it go." That was exactly what Felicity was afraid of. She knew enough about Caleb by now to understand that he took threats to his ranch personally. He'd worked too hard to build this place to let someone tear it down without a fight. But fights could go wrong, and people could get hurt, and the thought of something happening to him made her feel physically ill. The afternoon stretched into evening, and still Caleb didn't return. Felicity kept dinner warm on the stove, pacing between the kitchen and the front window every few minutes to watch for signs of his approach. When full dark fell and there was still no sign of him, she began to seriously worry. Miguel and Raphael had returned to their cabin an hour ago, promising to come back if Caleb wasn't home by morning. Felicity was alone in the big house, listening to every creak and groan of the settling wood, jumping at shadows. She tried to read one of the books Caleb had lent her, but the words blurred on the page, her mind too fractured with worry to focus. When she finally heard hoofbeats approaching the house, she rushed to the door and flung it open, relief flooding through her at the sight of Caleb dismounting from his horse. He was dusty and tired-looking, but he appeared unhurt, and that was all that mattered. "Thank God," she said, hurrying down the porch steps. "I was starting to think something had happened to you." Caleb looked surprised by her obvious concern but not displeased. "Sorry I'm late." "The sheriff and I rode out to check some of the usual hiding spots for stolen cattle, but we didn't find anything. He's going to keep looking, and he's putting out word to the other ranches to be on alert." "Did you eat?" Felicity asked, already knowing the answer. "Not since breakfast," he admitted. "Come inside. I'll fix you a plate." She heated up the beef stew she'd made for dinner and sliced fresh bread while Caleb washed up and settled at the table. He ate with the mechanical efficiency of a man who was too tired to really taste his food, and Felicity watched him with a mixture of affection and exasperation. "You need to take care of yourself," she said as she poured him coffee. "You're no good to the ranch if you work yourself into the ground." "Yes, madam," he said with a slight smile. "Though I have to say, it's nice having someone worry about me. I've been on my own for so long I'd forgotten what that felt like." "Well, get used to it," Felicity said, more tartly than she'd intended. "Someone has to make sure you don't do something stupid." Caleb laughed at that, a genuine sound that eased some of the tension in his shoulders. "Is that your job now, keeping me from doing stupid things?" "Apparently," she said, sitting down across from him. "You're doing a terrible job of it on your own." They sat in comfortable silence while he finished eating, the kind of easy quiet that only comes from knowing someone well. When he was done, Caleb pushed back his plate and looked at her with an intensity that made her pulse quicken. "Felicity," he said, and just the way he said her name made her heart skip. "Can I ask you something?" "Of course." He seemed to gather his thoughts, his hands wrapped around the coffee cup like it was an anchor. "Why did you stay? When I told you your debt was paid, you could have left. Could have gone anywhere. Why did you choose to stay here?" Felicity felt her breath catch. This was it, the moment where she could either be honest about her feelings or retreat into safe half-truths. She looked into Caleb's green eyes and saw her own uncertainty reflected back at her, mixed with something that might have been hope. "I stayed because I wanted to," she said carefully. "Because for the first time in a very long time, I felt like I was home. This place, this work, it all feels right in a way nothing else has, and you." She paused, gathering her courage. "You make me feel safe, valued, like I matter." Caleb set down his coffee cup, his eyes never leaving hers. "You do matter. More than you know." He stood and came around the table, and Felicity rose to meet him, her heart pounding so hard she was sure he must be able to hear it. When he reached out to cup her face in his hand, his palm rough with calluses but infinitely gentle, she leaned into the touch like a flower toward the sun. "I've been trying to fight this," Caleb said softly. "Trying to tell myself it was inappropriate that you work for me and I shouldn't complicate things. But the truth is, I stopped thinking of you as my employee about 2 weeks after you got here. You're so much more than that." "What am I then?" Felicity whispered, barely daring to hope. "Everything," he said simply. "You're everything, Felicity. You're the reason I rush through my work so I can get back to the house. You're the reason I actually look forward to meals instead of just viewing them as fuel. You're the first thing I think about in the morning and the last thing on my mind at night. I'm falling in love with you, and I don't want to fight it anymore." Tears pricked at Felicity's eyes, but they were happy tears, joyful tears that came from hearing the words she'd been longing to hear. "I love you too," she said, her voice breaking slightly. "I've been in love with you for months, and I didn't know how to tell you, didn't know if you could ever feel the same way about someone like me." "Someone like you," Caleb repeated incredulously. "Felicity, you're the strongest, most capable, most beautiful woman I've ever met. I'm the one who should be wondering if I'm good enough for you." Before she could argue with that absurd statement, he leaned down and kissed her. It was gentle at first, tentative, as if he was giving her the chance to pull away. But Felicity had no intention of pulling away. She'd been dreaming about this moment for so long that now that it was happening, she wanted to savor every second of it. She kissed him back with all the pent-up longing and love she'd been carrying, her arms winding around his neck as his came around her waist, pulling her closer. The kiss deepened, becoming more urgent, and Felicity felt like she was finally, fully alive for the first time since her father died. Maybe for the first time ever. When they finally broke apart, both breathing heavily, Caleb rested his forehead against hers. "I should probably court you properly," he said, sounding dazed. "Take you to dinner in town, bring you flowers, all the things a gentleman is supposed to do." "You can do all of that," Felicity agreed, smiling up at him. "But only if you promise to kiss me like that again." "I think I can manage that," he said, and proved it by kissing her once more. They spent the rest of the evening on the porch, sitting close together as Caleb told her all the things he'd been wanting to say for months. How he'd noticed the way she hummed while she cooked, how her smile could brighten his entire day, how he'd fallen asleep more than once imagining what it would be like to build a real life with her. Felicity shared her own confessions about the way her heart would race when she heard him coming in from the fields, about how she'd started wearing her better dress more often in hopes that he might notice, about the dreams she'd had of a future that included him. "I want that future," Caleb said, his arm around her shoulders as they watched the stars. "I want it more than I've ever wanted anything, but I also want to do this right. I don't want you to feel pressured or obligated because you work for me or because I gave you a chance when you needed one." "Caleb," Felicity said firmly, turning to look at him, "I love you because of who you are, not because of what you've done for me. Yes, you gave me a chance when I desperately needed one, and I'll always be grateful for that. But I fell in love with the man who quotes poetry from memory, who built something remarkable through sheer determination, who treats his workers like family, and who kisses me like I'm the most precious thing in the world. That's why I love you." He pulled her close, kissing the top of her head. "Then we'll figure this out together. However long it takes, whatever we need to do, we'll figure it out." And sitting there under the New Mexico stars, wrapped in Caleb's arms, Felicity believed him. After so many months of uncertainty and fear, she'd finally found a place where she belonged, and more importantly, she'd found someone who loved her for exactly who she was. The next few months passed in a blur of happiness that Felicity had never imagined possible. True to his word, Caleb courted her properly, even though they lived under the same roof. He would bring her wildflowers picked from the fields, would take her riding around the ranch to show her his favorite spots, and once even convinced her to go to a dance in Fort Sumner, where they scandalized half the town by barely dancing with anyone but each other. The ranch hands had quickly picked up on the change in their relationship, but far from being scandalized, Miguel and Raphael seemed delighted. Miguel would wink at Felicity when Caleb wasn't looking, and Raphael had shyly told her that he'd never seen his boss so happy. The rustling problem had been solved when the sheriff tracked the stolen cattle to a gang operating out of the Badlands. Caleb's 5 cows were returned, though in poorer condition than when they'd been taken, and the rustlers were arrested and sent to trial. It had been tense for a few weeks, with Caleb and the other ranchers taking turns patrolling their properties, but things had eventually settled back to normal. As winter set in, covering the ranch in occasional dustings of snow, Felicity found herself more content than she'd ever been. She and Caleb had fallen into an easy partnership, working together to keep the ranch running smoothly. He'd started asking her opinion on decisions about the ranch, valuing her practical mind and good sense. She'd started thinking of the house as truly hers, making small changes and improvements that turned it from just a building into a real home. On a cold evening in early December, Caleb asked her to bundle up and come with him to the barn. Curious, Felicity wrapped herself in her warmest shawl and followed him out into the crisp night air. The barn was warm and smelled of hay and horses, and Caleb led her to the stall where his favorite mare had finally given birth to the foal she'd been carrying. "She's beautiful," Felicity breathed, watching the spindly-legged baby nurse while her mother looked on contentedly. "Have you named her yet?" "I was thinking you could name her," Caleb said. "She was born here in what I hope will be your home for the rest of your life." "Seems fitting that you should have the honor." Felicity looked at him sharply, her heart beginning to race at the implication in those words. "What are you saying, Caleb?" He took her hands in his expression more serious than she'd ever seen it. "I'm saying that I love you, Felicity Portman. I'm saying that I want to spend the rest of my life with you, waking up every morning knowing you're here, going to sleep every night with you beside me. I'm saying that this ranch, this house, this life I've built, it's all meaningless without you to share it with." He reached into his pocket and pulled out a simple gold ring, the band etched with a delicate pattern of leaves. "This was my mother's. It's not fancy, and I know you deserve better, but I want you to have it. I want you to marry me, Felicity. I want to make this official in the eyes of God and the law and everyone who matters. Will you? Will you marry me?" Tears were streaming down Felicity's face, but she was smiling so hard her cheeks hurt. "Yes," she said, her voice breaking with emotion. "Yes, of course I'll marry you. I love you so much, Caleb. I never thought I could be this happy." He slipped the ring onto her finger and it fit perfectly, as if it had been made for her. Then he was kissing her, and she was kissing him back, and the mare whickered softly as if in approval of the whole situation. "When?" Felicity asked when they finally came up for air. "When should we get married?" "How about Christmas?" Caleb suggested. "It's only 3 weeks away. We could have a small ceremony in town, invite Miguel and Raphael and a few friends. Nothing fancy, just us and the people who matter, starting our life together." "Christmas sounds perfect," Felicity agreed. "Absolutely perfect." They were married on Christmas Day in the small church in Fort Sumner, with Miguel serving as Caleb's best man and the shopkeeper's wife, Mrs. Carson, standing up for Felicity. It was a simple ceremony, but beautiful in its simplicity. Felicity wore a new dress that Caleb had insisted on buying for her, a deep blue that brought out her eyes, and she carried a small bouquet of winter greenery tied with a white ribbon. When the preacher pronounced them man and wife and Caleb kissed her, Felicity felt like her heart might burst from sheer joy. This was her family now, this man who loved her enough to make her his wife, these friends who had gathered to celebrate with them. She'd been alone for so long, lost and uncertain, and now she had a place where she belonged and a future that stretched out bright and full of promise. The wedding supper was held back at the ranch, with Felicity having prepared most of the food the day before. Miguel had contributed his wife's famous tamales, and Mrs. Carson had brought a beautiful cake she'd baked as a wedding gift. They ate and laughed and toasted the happy couple, and when Miguel pulled out a guitar and started playing, Caleb swept Felicity into a dance right there in the main room of the ranch house. "Happy, Mrs. Quinn?" he asked, spinning her gently. "Happier than I knew was possible, Mr. Quinn," she replied, beaming up at him. Later, after their guests had left and they were finally alone, Caleb carried her over the threshold of their bedroom, the room that had been his alone but was now theirs to share. He set her down gently and cupped her face in his hands. "I promise you," he said solemnly, "I will spend the rest of my life trying to make you as happy as you make me. I will protect you and provide for you and love you with everything I have. You'll never be alone again, Felicity. Never." "I know," she said, kissing him softly. "I trust you, Caleb, completely." Their wedding night was everything Felicity had hoped it would be, tender and passionate and filled with whispered words of love. Afterwards, lying in Caleb's arms with her head on his chest, listening to the steady beat of his heart, she marveled at how much her life had changed in less than a year. She'd gone from a desperate woman trying to steal cattle to survive, to a wife with a home and a husband who loved her more than she'd ever dreamed possible. It seemed impossible, like something out of one of the romantic novels she loved to read. But it was real as the ring on her finger and the man holding her close. "I love you," she whispered into the darkness. "I love you too," Caleb murmured, pressing a kiss to her hair. "Always." The months after their wedding were filled with the work and rhythm of ranch life, but now everything was colored by the joy of their partnership. Caleb taught Felicity to ride properly, not just the basic seat she'd managed before, but really ride. They would go out together in the evenings when the work was done, racing across the open prairie until they were both breathless and laughing. Felicity continued to cook and manage the household, but now Caleb would often join her in the kitchen, stealing kisses while she tried to knead bread or sneaking tastes of whatever she was making for dinner. The house felt truly alive now in a way it never had before, filled with laughter and love and the comfortable domesticity of two people building a life together. Spring came, bringing new calves and the endless work of branding and moving the herd to fresh pasture. Felicity learned to help with the bookkeeping, her neat handwriting filling the ledgers as she tracked expenses and profits. She had a good head for numbers, it turned out, and Caleb valued her input on the business side of the ranch. "You're a full partner in this," he told her one evening as they went over the books together. "Your name is on the deed now, and that means this is as much yours as it is mine. I want to hear your thoughts on everything." In May, Felicity realized she'd missed her monthly courses twice and began to suspect she might be pregnant. The thought both thrilled and terrified her. She'd seen too many women die in childbirth, had heard too many stories of things going wrong. But she also desperately wanted a child, wanted to give Caleb a son or daughter, wanted to build the family they'd both dreamed of. She waited another week to be sure before telling him, choosing a quiet evening when they were sitting on the porch watching the sunset. "Caleb," she said, her heart pounding, "I have something to tell you." He turned to look at her, immediately picking up on the seriousness in her tone. "What is it? Is something wrong?" "No, nothing's wrong, at least I don't think so." She took a deep breath. "I think I'm going to have a baby." "I'm fairly certain, actually." The expression that crossed Caleb's face was one of pure, unfiltered joy. "A baby? Really? You're sure?" "As sure as I can be without seeing a doctor. I've missed my courses and I've been feeling sick in the mornings. All the signs are there." Caleb let out a whoop of excitement and pulled her into his arms, spinning her around until she was dizzy and laughing. "We're going to have a baby," he said, setting her down and immediately looking worried. "Should I be spinning you around? Is that safe? You should sit down. Do you need water?" Felicity laughed at his sudden nervousness. "I'm pregnant, not made of glass. I'm fine, I promise." But Caleb was already fussing over her, adjusting the cushions on her chair and asking if she needed anything. It was endearing, if a bit overwhelming, and Felicity knew she was in for 9 months of being treated like precious porcelain. True to her prediction, Caleb became almost comically overprotective as her pregnancy progressed. He insisted on hiring a woman from town to help with the heavier housework, refused to let Felicity lift anything heavier than a teacup, and read every book on pregnancy and childbirth he could get his hands on. Felicity found it both exasperating and deeply touching. He loved her so much, loved their unborn child so much, that he couldn't help but worry. The pregnancy was relatively easy, all things considered. She was sick in the mornings for the first few months, but after that, she felt better than she had in years. Her body changed and grew, and Caleb would marvel at her expanding belly, talking to their baby through the taut skin. "Hello in there," he would say, his hand spread across her stomach. "This is your father. I just wanted you to know that you're already the most loved baby in all of New Mexico. We can't wait to meet you." Miguel and Rafael were thrilled at the news, and Miguel's wife Maria, whom Felicity had become close friends with, shared all her wisdom about pregnancy and babies. The whole ranch seemed to be holding its breath in anticipation of the new arrival. As summer faded into fall and Felicity grew larger and more uncomfortable, Caleb became even more attentive. He would rub her swollen feet in the evenings, help her find comfortable positions to sleep, and generally do whatever he could to ease her discomfort. "I feel like a whale," Felicity complained one evening in late October as she tried and failed to find a comfortable position in bed. "You're beautiful," Caleb said firmly. adjusting the pillows behind her back. "You're carrying our child, and there's nothing more beautiful than that." "You're required to say that. You're my husband." "I'm saying it because it's true. You've never been more beautiful to me than you are right now." Felicity felt tears prick at her eyes, the emotional volatility of pregnancy making her cry at the smallest kindness. "I love you so much," she said, reaching for his hand. "I'm so glad I tried to steal your cow that day." Caleb laughed at that. "Well, that's a sentence I never thought I'd hear, but I'm glad too. Best decision I ever made, not turning you over to the sheriff." "Second best," Felicity corrected. "The best decision was marrying me." "You're right," he agreed, kissing her softly. "The best decision of my life." Their son was born on a cold November morning after a labor that lasted nearly 20 hours. Caleb stayed with Felicity the whole time, despite Maria trying to shoo him out, holding her hand and whispering encouragement even as she cursed him for putting her through this. When the baby finally arrived, red-faced and screaming, Caleb cut the cord with shaking hands and then burst into tears himself. "It's a boy," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "Felicity, we have a son." They named him Thomas, after Caleb's father, and from the moment he was placed in her arms, Felicity was lost. She'd never known she could love someone so completely, so immediately. He was perfect, from his tiny fingers that wrapped around hers to the dark fuzz of hair on his head that was already curling like his father's. Caleb was an attentive father from the start, getting up with Felicity for the night feedings even though there was little he could do, changing diapers without complaint, and spending hours just holding his son and staring at him in wonder. "I can't believe we made this," he said one evening, cradling Thomas in his arms while Felicity rested. "He's so perfect, so small and perfect and completely ours." "He has your eyes," Felicity observed, noting the green that was already starting to show in Thomas's gaze. "And I think he's going to have your stubborn chin too." "Poor kid," Caleb said with a grin. "Let's hope he gets your brains to balance it out." The first year of Thomas's life flew by in a blur of sleepless nights and endless wonder. Felicity marveled at how much she'd come to love this life, this family she and Caleb had built together. The ranch was thriving, with the cattle herd growing and the business finally turning a solid profit. They'd added on to the house, building a proper nursery for Thomas and planning for more children to come. On their first wedding anniversary, Caleb gave Felicity a beautiful locket with a tiny portrait of Thomas inside. "So you can always keep him close to your heart," he said, fastening it around her neck. "He's already there," Felicity said, touching the locket gently. "Both of you are." When Thomas was 2, Felicity found herself pregnant again, and this time the news was met with joy untainted by fear. She knew what to expect now, knew that Caleb would be there every step of the way, knew that they could handle whatever came. Their daughter was born in the spring, an easier birth than Thomas had been, and they named her Sarah after Felicity's mother. She had Felicity's blonde hair and a sunny disposition that had everyone wrapped around her tiny finger from the moment she arrived. Caleb was utterly smitten with his daughter, carrying her everywhere and spoiling her shamelessly. "I have no defense against her," he admitted when Felicity teased him about it. "She smiles at me, and I turn into pudding." The years passed in a happy rhythm of work and family, of watching their children grow and their love deepen. Thomas grew into a curious, energetic boy who followed his father everywhere, already talking about being a rancher when he grew up. Sarah was her mother's shadow, always wanting to help in the kitchen or tend to the chickens. When Felicity was 30, they had a third child, another son they named James. When she was 33, she had twin girls, Emma and Grace, who kept the entire household in a state of cheerful chaos. The ranch continued to prosper, becoming one of the most successful in the territory. Caleb expanded the house twice more to accommodate their growing family, and Felicity filled it with love and laughter and the warmth that turned a house into a home. On their 15th wedding anniversary, Caleb surprised her with a trip to Santa Fe, arranging for Maria to watch the children so they could have a few days alone together. It was the first time they'd been away from the ranch and the children since Thomas was born, and it felt like a second honeymoon. They stayed in a nice hotel, ate in restaurants, and walked through the plaza like two young people courting instead of the established married couple they were. On their last evening, as they watched the sunset from their hotel room window, Caleb pulled Felicity into his arms. "You ever regret it?" he asked. "This life we've built. Sometimes I wonder if you would have been happier doing something else, being someone else." Felicity turned in his arms to look at him, surprised by the question. "Regret it? Caleb, I love our life. I love our children, our ranch, our friends. I love waking up next to you every morning and falling asleep in your arms every night. This is everything I never knew I wanted." "Even though you gave up your dream of being a teacher." "I didn't give it up," Felicity corrected gently. "I'm teaching our children, aren't I? And half the ranch hands children too, since they started coming by for lessons. I'm using everything I loved about that dream, just in a different way than I imagined. And honestly, this is better. This is real and mine and ours." Caleb kissed her then, soft and sweet and full of 15 years of love and partnership. "I love you, Felicity Quinn. I love you more now than I did the day we married, and I'll love you more tomorrow than I do today. You're the best thing that ever happened to me. Even better than building your ranch," she teased. "The ranch is just land and cattle and buildings," he said seriously. "You're my heart, my home, my everything. You always will be." They made love that night with the tenderness of long familiarity and the passion of enduring love, and Felicity felt grateful beyond measure for the path her life had taken. She'd started as a desperate woman trying to steal a cow, and she'd ended up with a love story that surpassed anything she'd ever read in her beloved books. As they grew older, Caleb and Felicity watched their children grow into capable, loving adults. Thomas took over more and more of the ranch operations, showing a natural talent for the work and a deep love for the land that reminded Felicity of his father. Sarah married a kind young man from Fort Sumner and gave them their first grandchildren. James decided to become a teacher, inspired by his mother's lessons and her love of learning, and the twins were still young enough that their futures were unwritten. On the afternoon of Felicity's 50th birthday, she sat on the porch of the ranch house with Caleb beside her, just as they'd done countless times over the past 27 years. Their grandchildren were playing in the yard, their laughter floating on the warm New Mexico breeze. Thomas was in the barn with his father, probably talking about which pastures to rotate the herd to. Sarah was in the kitchen helping prepare the birthday supper, and the twins were supposed to be setting the table but were probably gossiping about boys instead. "What are you thinking about?" Caleb asked, taking her hand in his. His hair was silver now, and lines creased his face, but his green eyes were still as sharp and clear as they'd been the day he'd caught her trespassing all those years ago. "I'm thinking about that day," Felicity said, squeezing his hand. "When you found me trying to steal your cattle, I was so scared, so desperate. I thought my life was over." "Instead it was just beginning," Caleb said softly. "Instead it was just beginning," she agreed. "You saved me that day, Caleb. Not just from the sheriff or from starvation, but from a life of loneliness and fear. You gave me a home, a family, a purpose. You gave me everything." "We gave each other everything," he corrected. "I was just going through the motions before you came along. Building the ranch, sure, but for what?" I had no one to share it with, no reason for any of it except pride and stubbornness. You made it all mean something." They sat in comfortable silence, watching the sun paint the sky in shades of orange and pink. Somewhere in the house, someone started playing the piano, probably one of the twins practicing the piece they'd been working on. The smell of roasting meat drifted from the kitchen, and Felicity could hear Sarah laughing at something. This was her life, she thought with deep contentment. This beautiful, chaotic, wonderful life full of people she loved and work that mattered, and a man who had chosen her when she had nothing, who had loved her when she felt unlovable, who had built a life with her that exceeded her wildest dreams. "I love you," she said, not for the first time and certainly not for the last. "Thank you for catching me that day in more ways than one." Caleb lifted her hand to his lips and kissed it gently. "Thank you for being worth catching, now and always, Felicity, now and always." As the sun set on another day at the Quinn ranch, Felicity leaned her head on her husband's shoulder and smiled. She'd been a trespasser once, desperate and alone. But Caleb hadn't just caught her trespassing on his land. He'd caught her heart, and in the process, he'd given her his own. Together, they'd built something remarkable, something that would last long after they were gone, a legacy of love that would live on in their children and grandchildren and all the generations to come. It was, she thought, the happiest ending she could have ever imagined, and it was all the sweeter for being real.